We are very happy to have today Michael Geyer, which is German and American. I checked before coming here. German and American, not German American, but German and American historian, because he was born in Germany in 1947. He graduated from Freiburg University in Breslau, yes, in the south of Germany, which is in Schwarzwald, on the Danube bank, yes, of close to the place where Danube is flowing down to, including to Moldova, 300 meters. You know, actually this connects us. Because unlike Laura Engelstein, who talked today here, it's connected to Moldova because he has roots here. Her grandfather was born in Copanca in 1886, and her mother was born in 1920 in Tiraspol. So Michael is connected to Moldova through Danube, symbolically, let's say. I don't think we'll have time on Friday to go to the port of Giurgiulești, which is just on the place where Prut is intersecting with Danube. But let me say a few words about Michael. So Michael got his PhD, Doctor of Philology, yes, in German, from University of Freiburg in Breslau in 1976. The next year, he did research in Oxford. In 1977, he moved to United States, and he taught about 10 years at Michigan University. And then from 1986, he moved to the University of Chicago, yes? And he retired recently from there, and it's Professor Emeritus of German and European history. So let me say a few words about his main topics of research. His main topics of research is 20th century German and European history. Michael have written on such topics as the German military resistance against the Third Reich, the politics of memory, the culture of death and sacrifice, intellectuals in contemporary Germany, religion and belief, and many more. Lately, Michael ventured into Japanese, American, and Soviet history. He wants to do more research on other topics, including love and friendship, and the variety of intimate communities of all kinds, or the way the German and European countryside radically changed in the course of the 20th century. I'll limit only to my introductory words to point to several volumes that Michael authored or edited. Among them is more recently, because I have the hard copy, more recently and connected to the interest of students from history. It's a seminal book on comparing Stalinism and Nazism from the point of view of going beyond totalitarianism, you know, the Cold War definition of totalitarian regimes, authoritarian totalitarian regimes in 20th century. And it was co-edited with Sheila Fitzpatrick. We hope to have her here as well someday. We are in contact with her, and she is interested in the late Stalinist period, and hopefully she will be as well here someday. Michael also published, I would say, also very influential articles in different journals, including in American Historical Review. Could be that our students would be interested in that. It's called, in an article in 1995, World History in Global Age. And he's also interested in, and this is the end of my introductory, he's also interested in how we can write contemporary history in the global age. And we met in 2004 in Potsdam at a conference on Europeanizing European history, and we met 21 years after. It's more like the, Musketeers. 20 years, we are meeting 21 years after. So, Michael, you have the floor. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Dr. Cașu, for inviting me, and it's a great honor and a delight to share some of my thoughts with you about the state of Europe, and less so, but still very prominently, the Near East. Dr. Cașu had contacted my brilliant wife, Laura Engelstein, and discovered in the process that she was married to a certain Michael Geyer, whom he encountered way back in a lecture about Europe a very long time ago. Apparently, back then, I argued that German defeat in World War II was the prerequisite for the European Union, an argument that you will encounter today as well. I remember the talk for something else, and maybe that something else came in only after the fact in the written version. In the written version, I argued that Europe reminded me of the famous grin of the Cheshire cat. You may recall Alice in Wonderland. The Cheshire cat has a grin that is apparent, that is, it's grinning all over the place, while the body of the cat is absent. That is, you have the grin, but no body. And that simile, that image, where you have a very distinct presence, a presence of a Europe, but really have a hard time figuring out what that body of the cat is. That simile, I think, informs the talk I want to give today, although the reason and the specific purpose of the talk is somewhat different and is much more precise. I want to talk about the history of empire and the fragmentation of Europe as a state of affairs of this far west of the Eurasian continent. In part, I chose this theme of the history of empire and fragmentation because it provided an opportunity for me to reacquaint myself with the history of Southeastern Europe. Andrei, Cusco, of course, helped me greatly with his fabulous work, but there is a huge literature on Habsburg history, on Ottoman history, and all the nations in between. This literature contends with an argument you know, or in any case ought to know, because we have a name for fragmentation. Fragmentation is my kind of artificial word. It's a scientific word, as if you wish, or an analytic word for what is more commonly known as balkanization. And I agree that with my eminent colleague from the University of Illinois, Maria Todorova, that this is a pejorative term that does not reflect the reality of Europe, though it may at some point have reflected and maybe still reflects the reality of the Balkan and maybe other parts of Europe as well. So Maria Todorova, a Bulgarian scholar at Illinois, right, is one of my reference points. My other reference point is very contemporary, and you know it from the newspaper. In no small part, I chose the theme because the title of my talk reflects the way leading representatives of the current American government think of Europe. I mean, if you read the newspaper, you know fragmentation. It's a world, Europe, that is a world in the mind of at least some leading representatives of the American government, is a world of freeloading small states not just like Moldova, but small states like Germany who don't live up to their obligations, who all claim to be sovereign, right? But are incapable or unwilling to ascertain their external sovereignty, that is, halting illegal immigration, providing military defense, while imposing deep state censorship and suppressing free speech and free elections. The case here would be Romania, your neighbor, while pursuing deleterious, woke, or decadent policies. And in case you wonder who said this, you can check. This is US Vice President J.D. Vance, memorably at the Munich Security Conference in February 2025. So there you have it. This is a Europe in the state of fragmentation. It is incapable to act. It has no body. It is an assembly of discordant elements, small and large, but even the biggest ones, France, Great Britain, Germany, former imperial and would-be imperial powers, do not amount to much in the world we live in. Now, the recent cascade of events, again, cascade of events you are or ought to be familiar with, the war in Ukraine, the wars in the Near East, the new unilateralism of the United States, the not-so-silent whispers of a new Yalta. The historians should know among you. If not, check it on your smartphone. Yalta being the division of Europe, standing for the division of Europe into interest zones between the Soviet Union and the United States. That's Yalta as a fear and as an image. So the silent whispers of New Yalta have added urgency to the question about empire and fragmentation in Europe. So the question that I want to engage in, and the question that I want you to engage with me, is, as historian, how do we describe and how do we explain this peculiarly fragmented state of sovereignties in Europe, and for that matter in extension, and I will explain, the Near East? Is it truly a sign of weakness? I mean, are we kind of as an assembly of feeble governments that are incapable to act? Has that always been that way? or what might be the strengths of this divided and fragmented assembly of sovereignties? How is this assembly of sovereignties in Europe organized? The answer, or the approach I chose, is one that is guided by a British historian of the mid-20th century. His name is Geoffrey Barraclough, a medieval historian who, like many medieval historians in the course of World War II, turned to modern and contemporary history. He wrote a famous introduction into contemporary history, which shaped my young life as a graduate student way, way back. The key question is, how do you approach a history of the present? And he says, what you need to do is to carefully look at, as it were, you gazetteer, you have to look ethnographically and sociologically and politically, look what is, what you find in the present, and then try to figure out where the origins of this particular present are. And second, you have to go beyond that and try to figure out when was the last time in history that you saw a similar situation, that is a condition that reflected the potentials of the present. It's three moves, right? First, you have to look. What is? Then you have to say, where does this come from? What is? And then third, you have to think historically, as it were. Where do you find in history a situation that shows the potentials of the present? Now, you will discover that I find the history of the present in history in the 16th and 17th century. That is several centuries back. And part of my interpretation will be to toggle back and forth, between the present and that kind of past, and everything very briefly what is in between, and there is a lot of in between, right? So, let me add one more brief preliminary comment. I should say my experience is Europe, and more specifically Germany. The Near East is not my specialization, but sometimes I'm afraid you have to go beyond your specialization where you know very little, but you have to learn. And with this presence of a history beyond my specialization, I was confronted not simply due to the accident of my upbringing. I did indeed go to school 100 yards from the source of the Danube, so that is kind of neat, right? And my history was always down the Danube rather than up the Rhine. That is down the Danube to the Black Sea rather than up the Rhine to the North Sea. But the accident that actually shaped my understanding of Europe was a request by the Polish-American Copernicus Society in Ann Arbor, Michigan, to give a lecture on the siege of Vienna in 1683. So way, way back, siege of Vienna. I hope you remember it. It's an important date. It's certainly an important date in my history. It's the confrontation at the capital of the Habsburg Empire, and that is, as you know, Vienna, right, of two major powers. major European powers. Now think what those major powers might be. Well, it's not Germany, because Germany simply didn't exist at that time. There was, of course, the head of my sovereign, as it were, from the little duchy or markgraveship of Baden, who had the famous name, the famous nickname, Türkenlouis, the Turkish Louis, because he spent his life fighting the Turks, rather than spending his time in the spa of Baden-Baden, where he resided. But, you know, that's a small contingent. Who were the major forces that battled it out in Vienna? Well, you think of the Habsburgs. Okay, if you're a historian, you know the Habsburg at least by name. That's an empire that you put into the southeast of Europe. But Habsburg was beleaguered. The main military head, Starhemberg, famous general, was sitting in Vienna, waiting desperately for relief against a relief that was coming from one side, whereas the power that organized the seizure came from the other side. So who are the two powers? I'm spending some time over it to give you time to give you some occasion for thinking. Well, on the one hand, you have probably the single most important power in Europe at the time, and that is the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire, which had occupied all of southeastern Europe, came from the very center that seemed between Asia and Europe, that defined wealth and importance, as only Spain on the other side of Europe did, right? And his opponent was, well, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth that stretched from the Baltic all the way, not quite down to what is today Moldova, but pretty much covered the entire terrain of very Eastern Central Europe. A major power, the defining power that defeated the Ottoman Empire in front of Vienna in one of the grand battles that decided very decisively over the future of Europe. So, part of the reason why the Near East comes into this story, in my understanding, and the first part of the story, is that we have to remember that once upon a time, at a crucial moment, the future of Europe might well have been Ottoman. That is what is today. For those who really know nothing, what is left over is Turkey today, right? As a post-imperial state, fought over by a state or by a commonwealth that has entirely vanished from the scene. It has successes, but as an empire that once was able to fight and defeat the major power, one of the major powers, perhaps you should say, and that is the Ottoman Empire. That was the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. So that's a Europe. It's a Europe. I also think it's a Europe that we have as a simile, we should have as a simile in our mind. And if you look at this map, which is a very curious map, and I have a hard time decoding it as, well, it's the hidden Europe. In a sense, it is right. what is hidden here is the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, the absence of a history of Ottoman presence in Europe, and what is hidden here for the present, of course, for all your Western-minded German, French, British, Dutch, Italians, what you forget is that the larger part of Europe is in the east, is in the east of Warsaw, east of Prague, east of Vienna, all the way down to the Danube, to the Black Sea, all the way over into Ukraine. That's a huge territory. That's a huge area, which somehow, not in your presence, of course, you are here, part of this hidden Europe, but in the presence of the universal press, of the Western press, just isn't there very much. And besides what is there, and this is, I'm going to my second point, this is a Europe that looks very well organized, right? Neat nation states, some very big, some rather smallish, some you don't even see on this map. You don't see the Principality of Liechtenstein on this map. You barely see Luxembourg, but they are states. Right? So you have an assembly of sovereigns here where, and this is the point I want you to keep in mind, there once upon a time there were huge empires. First, there was, of course, the classic antique empire, the Roman Empire, and even before that, you should add, there was the Hellenistic Empire, all stretching all the way into what is today Iran. So this is imperial territory par excellence. But Europe, this part of the world, and I will now call it the far west of the Eurasian continent, because that's what it is. That's what down there the Near East is, and that's what up there Europe is. The far west of the Eurasian continent is not a terrain for empire anymore, as it was once upon a time. It is the terrain for fractured and fragmented sovereignties. So, if we start from this point, that the Europe and the Near East are fracture zones in the Eurasian hemisphere, right? And by fracture zones, we simply mean the fact that there once was empire. Empire did not expand as it did in China, right, to encompass all, or as it did in Russia, as it covered this huge landmass. Europe and the Near East are peculiarly distinct because they form fractures. Fractures of sovereign states of some power, indeed, eventually world power, which has come and gone, but still fractures that matter. And yet, we are unable at any one point to form a unified empire despite ambitions. The last point, and that is again 1683, the last point that could have happened, and that's an involved historical argument, was indeed when the Ottoman Empire pushed deep into Central Europe and was close to conquering Vienna, though Vienna was relieved by a Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth that no longer existed. The other opportunity, the only other opportunity of universal empire, Europe as a universal empire had come before, but it doesn't play a role here. It did not come from Germany, it came from Spain. Spain unifying a kind of imperial colonial hinterland in the Americas, and reaching across the richest provinces of Europe, Burgundy, Flanders in the west, all the way to Czechoslovakia, the Bohemian coast, the richest area in Europe in the 16th century, and all the way to Vienna as the capital of what then could well be considered the world. That's the last time Europe had the potential to become a unified entity. Did not happen. But lo and behold, what we have is fragmentation. But lo and behold, fragmentation, oddly, was the source for what you know and what you remember. This fragmented Europe of sovereigns, not Europe as a unitary empire, but this fragmentary Europe of sovereigns, Great Britain, France, even Belgium or Germany, Denmark not to forget, Spain, Portugal, they became the powers that for a brief moment conquered and occupied and dominated the world. So, what you learn from this fragmentation here is apparently not balkanization that is becoming minor and minor and minor, but fragmentation in odd ways means power, strength. But how do we explain that? Well, let me first go through some further exercise in terms of fragmentation. Of course, in terms of fragmented areas or fragmented sovereignties, Europe and the Near East by far are not the only ones. The classic other area would be Southeast Asia, all the way from Southeast Asia then along the islands to the prominent power in the Far East as opposed to the Far West, the insular power, and that is Japan, right? Very interesting area here, not for me to explain or even to, not for me to introduce, but except for one reason. Because Southeast Asia has become, for anthropologists and for geographers, an area which gives fragmentation a certain meaning. Fragmentation in Southeast Asia is explained by anthropologists like James C. Scott or the Dutch historian and geographer Willem van Schendel as a space that they call Zomia space, as a space of withdrawal from big urban imperial concentrations, as a kind of reduit and retreat where you can hide, right? It's also a space that has very little government or no government, that has communities living next to each other, mixing with each other in this space that is altogether then a kind of anarchic utopia. Well, it's right and wrong. It's a lot more violent. It's now the site of kingpins, of drug kingpins and all sorts of anarchic behavior that shades into the criminal, as well as of a lot of freedom fighters in, for example, Myanmar, that claim autonomy for their areas. In Europe, you have such spaces as well. Interesting spaces, not Somia spaces exactly, but reduits. Reduits like Switzerland, that is areas in which you can retreat and which become so impenetrable that it is very hard to conquer them. It takes Napoleon or then the Russian army of Suvorov to actually occupy that area for a brief moment. But Somia spaces in Europe, like Switzerland, that is areas that are autonomous under self-control because they are so impenetrable and hard to fight. And the Swiss, of course, you know from the Swiss guards in the Vatican, but the Swiss in the 16th century were the quintessential brawlers and fighters and soldiers. They were the warriors everyone wanted. They were the fiercest of the kind. So, but even that Swiss in Europe needed international agreement to be autonomous. It needed the Peace of Vienna in 1815 that agreed that Switzerland is too important strategically for all other sovereigns around to be occupied by anyone. So let the Swiss be themselves and let the Swiss be neutral. That's the way Europe works. It works on the basis of the agreement of sovereigns. Now, add to this, once you have the Somia space out of the way, add to this the world of fragmentation that, of course, continues as post-colonial space, specifically post-colonial in Central and South America, and post-colonial in Africa. Their boundaries are set very distinctly by colonial powers. Boundaries that are completely artificial. But the artificiality of the boundaries doesn't distinguish those parts of the world. The boundaries in Europe and in the Near East are also artificial. They are bureaucratic, imposed by empires, period. What is interesting in the Latin American and African case, and what distinguishes them from the European and the Near Eastern space, and this is digging into some British state theory, international relations theory. What distinguishes them? Well, think about it. What distinguishes them? Europe and the Near East form tightly knit state systems. That is, they are not just a region in the world. They are a region in the world that organizes itself in war and peace around states that have some sort of compact, what I called in my old lecture way back, the grin of the cat. You may not be able to see it. It may in part be instituted, but it's clearly there. And it is in the tight interaction between a multiplicity of sovereigns of very different kind of power, that you organize that you find the organization of, that you organize a state system as opposed to a community of states that has as its kind of overarching assembly as international society, maybe the United Nations, but effectively international finance, international economy, bilateral agreements, a system of institutions that basically pulls them apart rather than pulling them together. Europe and the Near East are fragmented zones of sovereignty which form a distinct state systems. That is, I think, the part that you want to keep in mind. Now, I already overstepped my boundaries of time. I need to cut short a little and try to rearrange. Well, is this the world we see? That is the world of fragmented authority, powerful, some sovereigns like Germany, or on the other end of the Eurasian continent, the island of Japan. Is this the world of the future? In the 1980s and 90s, many theorists in Europe and in the Far East and in the United States thought, indeed, this is what is to come. The world would continue to fragment, would overcome sovereignty, would overcome empire, and would devolve into a world of nation states. Now, formally speaking, that's the world we have. But imagine the world map and simply begin to think of Eurasia as a unified continent. You will see to your amazement that Europe and the Near East, that is the far west of the Eurasian continent, is rather the exception than the norm. What you've got, and that would be a surprise, maybe not for you, but it is a surprise for me because I grew up at a certain point in a certain discussion about the world to come as an effect of globalization, which assumed naturally that empires or imperial configurations would devolve. They did not. In fact, what you got, especially in the Eurasian continent, is the revival and the renewal and indeed the self-assertion of very large territorial states. Very large territorial states with very powerful central authorities that are clearly capable to govern, are clearly capable to establish their own law, are clearly capable to control their own resources and their own people, even indeed their own peoples, because there are always many. If you look at a map of Eurasia, you see this, of course, on one hand, this, what is big here, but in effect is very small countries, right? As opposed to a huge Russia, which stretches all the way across the Eurasian continent. It You may have your opinions on Russia. You may think it's weak. You may think it has enough. It doesn't have enough people. It doesn't exploit its spaces. It doesn't even control its country. That's your opinion. But the fact is, it is a unified territory, and it is a very huge territorial state that functions very much as a huge territorial state, or as one of the German theorists who thought of this future, Carl Schmitt, a very dubious theorist because he has his Nazi affiliations, he spoke of Großraumstaaten, very large territorial states. But Russia, you might say, is the exception. It's simply there, and nobody wants the far north, right? Not quite. But it's there as a massive entity, but it's not the only one. You have the renewal and continuation and transformation, the revolutionary transformation of China. Very much a huge presence in this world. In some theories of empire, it is the future empire of the world. And not only that, you have India very much as the center or potential center, unified, though embattled at its borders, unified and very much a territorial empire, a kind of multipolar, multi-ethnic, multilinguistic empire that proves to all people that multilinguistic, multi-ethnic empires can work as very large territorial states. And of course, in the American hemisphere, you have a very significant United States. And if you don't read the newspapers, you probably haven't read, but if you read the newspaper, you know it's the United States that somehow thinks it must be newly expansive. It must incorporate an even larger state territorially, Canada, as its 51st state. An idiocy, because Canada is a very diverse entity, quite apart from it is being a sovereign state. And in addition, it must include Greenland, and it must include Panama to become a hemispheric state. Now, that's future dreams. It's a lot of hot air, maybe. It's certainly an ambition. But what matters in a world in which Europe and the Near East are highly fragmented, falling into small entities, it is in this world there are very large, very powerful states, and if you follow a certain trend, which I could explain in the discussion, if you follow certain trends in the German discussion about global and world power, you would argue with them, and my favorite here is Ludwig de Hio, an archivist who became a fabulous historian. You should think of him as your kind of patron saint, who thought that that these large territorial states are the only states that are capable of being world powers. Hence, the argument, this was an argument at the turn to the 20th century. Hence the argument for Germany and for Japan, because Japan was very much on the mind of the Germans at that point. For Germany to become world power, it had to become not simply a colonial power here and there, like in Southwest Africa, or even acquiring perhaps part of the Congo and so on and so forth, but it had to become a very large territorial state. And what did that mean? Well, at the very least, it meant the destruction of another empire. At the very least, in fact, it meant to conquer the Ukraine, what was then the Ukraine, the huge borderlands of Russia. But in fact, what it meant is to cover all of to destroy another empire. So, when I speak of Europe as a shatter zone of empire, I mean that this Europe that we have today, that you see here as a hidden Europe and as a visible Europe, that this Europe is indeed the product of the defeat of that construction. It is a defeat of Nazi Germany's conquest of to become a very large territorial state. And not just that, because becoming a large territorial state came not simply with an ideology, but it also came with an imperial program of remaking people in this vast imperial space. And what did that mean, the remaking people? It meant massive displacement on an unprecedented level that began really in World War I and continued in World War II, effectively reordering the map, the ethnic and the population map of Europe like nothing ever happened before. And erasing on top of it, as a kind of singularity, one people entirely from this world. A people, or a diaspora, if you wish, that had lived in this space for more than 1,000 years, was an integral part of all of Europe, although it didn't have a territory. That was, of course, the Jews in Europe, the Jewish diaspora. I speak of not simply of the fragmentation, but of the shattering of Europe in the 20th century, for the simple fact to recognize the deep and enduring effect of this massive population displacement, this massive erasure of one people and millions of others. Think of it, think of the casualties of World War II, add to those of World War I. You end up somewhere between around 50 million people. But think of it primarily as a redivision of space that continues after the war, right? With Poland being, or Polish nation being completely reorganized, and every other nation being affected too. This is the world that we have. And from this world, a new Europe has emerged. A Europe that is fragmented into various sovereigns, small and large. A Europe that is still seeking to find some kind of unity in diversity, and at this point no longer quite knows how to do it. Because of course, Europe did reorganize itself, and not just under what I also wanted to explain but didn't get to, under the influence of the two flanking powers, the United States and Russia, that organized this. But Europe did organize in something you see on every flag here around, and I was amazed to see so many European flags all over Moldova or Chisinau. This Europe is, for some people, a sovereign, and for some people it is an empire. For Orban in Hungary, it's very much an empire. But what does it lack? It's a Europe that cannot defend itself, absolutely incapable of doing it. It needs the Americans or the Russians to do it, or the agreement of both. And ultimately, and that is perhaps even more grinding, and if you look at today's newspaper, you see the decline of the Volkswagen profit by 41% in the first quarter of 2025. That is what you get. Ultimately, it is incapable of organizing and providing for its own wealth and welfare. This Europe is a unified sovereign in some way. It has institutions aplenty, but as is, it does not have the qualities of an empire, and it does not have qualities of a sovereign, and that is to provide for the welfare and of the security for its people. Now, one last word on the Near East, or two last words on the Near East, and then I will close. First, the war in the Ukraine. Think of it as an exercise of geographic thinking. What is at stake? Well, you have three areas of former power. You have Ukraine, Turkey, and Iran. Three former imperial domains that together form an immense bloc that bring a hidden Europe and a hidden Near East way into the open. If they were capable of ordering themselves, they'd be a world in themselves. They would be a state system that was truly flanking Europe. So that's the one kind of thing. Think productively and creatively about geography. The other point I wanted to make, because the Near East is different from Europe. It is a state system, as I said at the beginning, but it is a strange state system. It's a state system, an involuntary state system, as opposed to the voluntary state system of Europe. It's a state system that can't even agree on the principle whether it should exist, or whether the sovereigns in that terrain should all survive and exist. It's a state system that effectively aims at mutual destruction. And that is a deleterious affair. It's not the first time that this happens in this world, but it is certainly a very dangerous moment. And that's the moment we are in at the moment, at this point. That's the moment in which J.D. Vance can think that we are kind of weaklings that amount to nothing very much. But it's also the moment in which fragmentation, competition, but institutions and behaviors that organize that competition to be invented in the Near East, to be advanced in Europe onto a new plane, that's the future that would make Europe and the Near East into productive and somewhat unique members in a world of very large territorial states. And if you want to continue to think of this, you'd have to think again about other reasons. regions, Southeast Asia, East Asia. You'd have to think about Africa and South America and see if there are nuclei for similar organization, so that what would emerge from this is not simply a world dominated by great territorial powers, but a world in which regions and regional systems would reorder world politics and would indeed create a genuine world for the 21st century. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael, for a very, very interesting and a lot of new ideas. And I think Andrei would like to comment on that. Andrei Cusco is having a PhD. It's a graduate at the State University, Faculty of History, for younger generation that probably could not know that. And then he graduated from Central European University. He has a PhD degree there and is the most appropriate, let's say, Moldovan historian probably to comment on Michael Geyer's talk, because he worked on a topic related to empires and nationalism, more specifically Bessarabia in the 19th century as a contested territory between Romanian national project and Russian Tsarist imperial project. Andrei, you have the floor.
Thank you, Igor, for your kind introduction, and many thanks to Professor Geyer for this fascinating and very provocative talk. So there are so many points, so many directions you sort of alluded to and opened that it's quite difficult to comment in a coherent way on all of that. But nevertheless, I will do my best to highlight some points that I think are both very timely and interesting to our audience, and also could lead to a further discussion during the Q&A. So I think one of the central points you raised quite appropriately is actually the issue of to what extent is, well, Europe, or let's say the West as an entity, an exception in the sense of how, let's say, world powers or world hegemony works. And I'm thinking here quite some time back, I would say, to the classic work of William McNeil, right, The Rise of the West, where one of his arguments was that actually the rise of the West was, first of all, conjunctural, and most important of all, really exceptional, in the sense that it was both unprecedented and short-lived by the standards of world history, let's say, or global history. So in a way, that this Western moment in world history might be rather an aberration. And as you seem to point out, sorry if I misread you, but we can, of course, discuss that, it may well be that this aberration or exception is in its final stages now. That is, that this world of big territorial states would reassert itself. Okay, I will come to that point a bit later to let maybe our audience process this, because I think this is a difficult conceptual, conceptual feat for many of us, since even here, we are still here in our region, I mean, in basically on the borders of the West and the Near East. We are very Eurocentric in our curricula, in how we are educated as historians, as political scientists, as sociologists. We are still very much, understandably so, into seeing the West, whatever that means, as the pivotal region in world history. So, but another very interesting point is I would like to a bit to problematize this notion of shatter zone of empires, because of course your picture is much broader in using this notion than its, well, let's say, original or rather most well-known iteration, that is in the collective volume, for already classical and famous collective volume by Eric White and Omer Barkov, right? Who tried to circumscribe this notion of shatter zone of empires to the borderlands of the four imperial competitors vying for control over the East European region. That is the Russian, the Habsburg, the Ottoman, and also the German Empire during the early 20th century, let's say. So for Barkov and Weitz, this shatter zone of empires actually meant that area in the east of Europe, broadly defined, which was characterized by multi-ethnicity, first of all, and not only ethnic but religious diversity, by this constant contestation of the borderlands between rival hegemonic entities, so that were aiming to control the area, by the challenge of nationalist or national movements, starting from the second half of the 19th century up to World War II, and most importantly, perhaps I think this is their novel contribution to the debate, by highlighting that this shatter zone of empire was ultimately a zone of violence. Prior imperial coexistence, yes, but also a zone of violence, of warfare during the 20th century. And as you rightly point out, this defeat of imperial hegemony was what made possible not only the European project, but actually the whole post-World War II concept of international relations and of how the state system should work, basically, that is currently under siege, conceptually and also directly by, let's say, revisionist powers like Russia. Sorry for using this anachronistically a bit. So what I find really provocative, again, in a very good way, and refreshing, is to rethink of our whole region here, not only about Moldova, Romania, Ukraine, but the whole wider region between these four imperial actors that I mentioned earlier, as a region that has still not overcome its imperial legacies, right? That is still shaped by them, that is still dominated by this battle for hegemony. And also, in this sense, another very creative, let's say, example that we can think about is the Habsburg monarchy that you mentioned in connection with the siege of Vienna, but that was also very important in terms of the conceptual rethinking of sovereignty, right, in our, again, wider area of Eastern Europe. Because the Habsburg monarchy, as many recent works by historians like Natasha Wheatley or Peter Judson show, was an extremely important and completely overlooked, by the way, here in Moldova and even in Romania, which is amazing, because Romania is partly a successor state of the Habsburg monarchy, of course. It's completely overlooked in terms of how it shaped our understanding of sovereignty in the 20th century and even before World War I, but mostly after the imperial collapse. Because the Habsburg monarchy introduced a whole set of categories, starting from an interpretation of ethno-national federalism linked to figures like Aurel Popovici, for example, and his imperial, let's say, almost disciple Franz Ferdinand, or of how it influenced the Versailles settlement in 1918. So it inaugurated a whole array of new understandings of how sovereignties can be imagined, how they overlap, how this remaking of states and the system of nation-states is possible, basically. So I would urge everyone to come back to the Habsburg monarchy, which is, again, I have to retrospectively say that this was one of the great absences during my years here in Moldova as a student. There is no Habsburg monarchy. I mean, they don't teach it. And it's not only about Moldova. Again, it's about a whole area, a whole series of almost successor states to this empire, which should be there because it provides also the link between what we call Central Europe and the eastern borderlands. Okay, there is a lot to talk about here, but just to raise some points that could provoke further discussion. Okay, then now to return. To return to the point of European exceptionalism. Sorry for abusing this term. I remember a work that really shaped my understanding of empire, Dominic Lieven's Empires, the Russian Empire and its Rivals, which in its conceptual part really had this very interesting question about empire in Europe as opposed to the empire in the Far East. That is, the question was, why did empire persist in China, well, in the broader Chinese zone of influence, rather, and fail to consolidate itself in Europe? Exactly sort of the same kind of interrogation that you proposed to us today. And okay, there were many arguments that Lieven tried to invoke for accounting or for this difference, right? He spoke about the early consolidation efforts of the first emperor in China, the persistence of this imperial bureaucracy that acted as sort of a bearer of imperial values, the fact that the Han Chinese were always a numerical majority, which also facilitated, and many other economic arguments and so on and so forth. Whereas in Europe, of course, this fragmentation of sovereignty was linked to the emergence of the European system itself. And of course, one can debate when that happened exactly. You mentioned 1683 as a turning point. One could say that the Peace of Westphalia in 1648 was another turning point in terms of how sovereignty was really conceived of, really. Or even earlier, after the failure of this last attempt at imperial empire building in Europe, that is the Habsburg experiment, right? After Philip II, when it fails, basically. So this, and of course, the fragmentation of religious and secular authority, which was also very important in multiplying sovereignties, especially in the German, let's say, space, but far from only that, in that case. So, and this question leads us of why Europe was so exceptional, actually, leads us to the obverse side of the medal. That is to what can be called geopolitical thinking. Okay, of course, geopolitics is a late invention, mostly in the German-speaking world, but not only. I will only invoke here some names that might ring a bell for everyone. So, starting with, if we look at the American side, I don't know, Alfred Mahan, then Alfred Mackinder, then Karl Haushofer. So all those figures who, albeit discredited after World War II, still lurked in the background. And all these discussions about heartland and, the outlying areas, Rimland in Nicholas Spikeman's words. So in which Europe, well, this Europe, figured as an outlying, a peripheral region compared to the heartland. Now, the problem is that the heartland, although very much, of course, adopted by, for example, the Eurasianists or the Neo-Eurasianists, although they speak in a different vocabulary, was also appropriated by the Germans in the interwar period, by German geopoliticians. And that's why, and I completely agree here with you, World War II was, among other things, also a clear geopolitical contest between two imperial visions. Of course, the Soviets did not use geopolitics, but these two powers were in fact vying for hegemony over this heartland, right? And where I want to go with this is how this geopolitical thinking, despite its ostensible discreditation, finds unexpected and quite, I would say, troubling echoes in current debates in the United States, even. And I will refer here just to partly amuse you and to partly, I would say, point to how dangerous this strain of thinking is. I would point here to a very marginal line of thinking, but that explains much of what we hear now from Washington, from J.D. Vance, from the president, from other more marginal figures, from Elon Musk, about Greenland, Canada, Panama, and so on. What I mean here is a very peculiar fascist movement, well, proto-fascist, quasi-fascist movement that developed in the US in the late 1930s and early 1940s, which was called technocracy. Recently, a map was circulating online of the geopolitical fantasies of this technocratic thinking. I won't go into much detail. There was a guy called Howard Scott who sort of compiled a short course, one would say, right? A canonical version of the ideas of this technocracy. And the link is that apparently Elon Musk's maternal grandfather was a part of this. So what they wanted, basically, was the abolition of liberal democracy, representative government, and capitalism, and replacing all this with a technocratic utopia, which would have been led by engineers, by technicians, who would have efficiently, in their view, reformed the whole North American continent. And the map I'm talking about dates from the summer of 1940, a very important period for this region for many reasons. And this map depicts the whole North American continent, including Canada, and also including Greenland, which was not quite part of the North American continent, including the Panama Isthmus, including areas of Venezuela and Colombia, some of them, into what they called, so combining all these areas into what they called the American Technate. That was their designation of this dystopian project. Why I mention this? Not because it is actually the policy of the current American government, although we don't know actually exactly how influential these dystopian ideas are. Apparently in some circles they are. So, rather I would like to provoke you to think about how these ideas, as crazy as they may seem, are still very much with us, right? To give you another example of these apparently crazy geopolitical fantasies, there is a fascinating book by a late Russian author called Mikhail Yuryev, which has the very suggestive title Третья империя, Россия, которая должна быть, which would roughly, I would translate in English as the Third Reich, Russia as it should be, or the Russia that should exist, where we have a very, I would say, literary, let's say, interpretation of this argument that the world should be divided into 5 major continental powers. That is, the Russian Empire, comprising all of Eurasia and all of Western Europe, including, so from Lisbon to Vladivostok. If that reminds you of Medvedev's thinking, yes, that's what their frame of thinking is. Then there would be the so-called American Federation, comprising both the Western Hemisphere. No United States. The West as a category should disappear forever in their thinking. Then there should be the so-called Celestial Republic, comprising China and its sphere of influence, India, the 4th player, the Southern Asia, and interestingly enough, the Islamic Caliphate that for a now known reason should also encompass not only the Islamic areas but also the whole of Africa. So, okay. So these geopolitical fantasies are very much with us. I'm not saying they shape policies, but imperial thinking and great power thinking in this territorial, very, very crude understanding is resurging. And it is a very important challenge for Europe, for the European Union, because, and here I will end, my last sort of provocative point to you is that the European Union is still, and again, I do agree with you completely, it is still searching for where to place itself, in the sense that it is partly a sovereign and partly fails to exercise sovereignty, but it could be, well, a new kind of empire, not a territorial one. And if we discard these traditional patterns of imperial thinking, like empire means territorial hegemony, it could be an empire in the sense of a great power of shared values or shared institutions or shared practices. But for that, of course, it needs to embrace its imperial dimension in the sense of unifying the sovereignty of its constituent parts. And this is where the real challenge lies, because when you label something an empire, you immediately discredit it in the meaning that we are accustomed to. So, is the European Union an empire? Definitely not in Orban's sense, not in all these so-called sovereigntists. That's another whole discussion. Why they hijack the term, basically. Why the extremists hijack the term sovereignty. Okay. So I guess I really will stop here, and thank you very much for this very exciting and very thought-provoking presentation. And now to the Q&A, unless you have some comments.
Maybe just one very brief comment, essentially clarification and definition and agreement to disagree. This concerns the shatter zones of empire, because indeed I differ very much from Bartov and Weitz, and I also, although I admire the Habsburg historians, I also disagree with the thrust of Habsburg history. The Habsburg history effectively argues Habsburg Empire is modern. It has developed an amazing way of accommodating diversity and ethnicity and territoriality that is absolutely stunning. And my response, and there is, I have my hat on as military historian, my response is, well, that's fine and good. It is modern, it is beautiful, but unfortunately it loses wars, and that you cannot do in Europe. Europe, you have to understand, is a very violent continent. I mean, the past 50 years, and especially the 1990s, deceived us all in a way, and kind of detracted us from what is central, and that is, on the one hand, making war, and on the other hand, from 1648 to 1815 to 1918, it has always been capable of making peace. The challenge of making peace again is now the challenge today. What the shatter zone of empire is concerned, I disagree with Bartov and Weitz, who argue that shatter zones happen in border areas. That's also some of your thinking, I think, in one way, in some way. But yes, it's natural to think of that this way in the southeastern Europe, where you do have the active competition of empires. I think of the shatter zone as shattering from the center out. You have to realize that the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, of course, it's always argued it's this aristocratic republic that would fall apart anyway, but it is defeated, right? It is defeated from the center in 1648. It's celebrated as a peace agreement, but it is a peace agreement after 30 years of wars that effectively shatter German hegemony over Europe. And so it goes. 1815 is the shattering of the French hegemonic ambition. 1918 is the shattering of the German hegemonic ambition. It is shattering happens from the center out. rather than from the periphery in. And then you have combinations of the two in the aftermath, and that is post-1918 to 23, all the turmoil. So that's the only thing I wanted to clarify. That's the easy part anyway.
Thank you very much, Michael, again, and Andrei, for a very, very interesting comments, very interesting comments, and a lot of suggestions for you, students. So now, questions, comments? Of course, what you heard today is something different, but we are doing during our classes. We are more kind of empirical, kind of data and data and so on and so on. So it's very, very difficult, very conceptual approach to empires, to Europe, to the world in general. But if you have questions or comments or something you didn't understood, please. Olympia? Abbiamo un microfono.
Well, I would like to start by saying how extraordinary opportunity both Laura and you gave us to hear your presentations, to learn from your experience, from your knowledge, and we are very grateful for that. But my question relates to the present. I always use the opportunity of having such extraordinary people in front of us and to ask them about how do you see Moldova? We see Moldova in the European Union because we feel that this is where our future place is. We share the values of the European Union and we feel that we will be stronger there. When coming to Moldova and see us, our country, the people here, what do you think Moldova future is? Because we are struggling between a hybrid war from Russia, a war that is in Ukraine, and probably an attitude of a society who still is struggling to determine its future. Thank you.
To the borderland areas, both to Transnistria and Gagauzia, but it's earlier to ask probably what you think, but Michael.
Let me answer the question, and I won't weasel out saying that I'm not a specialist on Moldova, which I'm not, but I'm glad to be here, to familiar, and I've done my homework to some extent, as I should, and as everyone should. And I should say, as a historian, I can't predict. I can even less can predict the future even less than political scientists, and certainly economists can. And they specialize in the future, and they don't understand it. But what I do understand is two things. First thing, any nation does not exist in Europe as if naturally existent. Now, some nations think they do, like the Poles have a very strong sense of themselves as ethnic entity. But effectively, as a nation, they only come together as a civil or civic society. And I think working to build a civic society, which isn't so easy in Moldova, I understand, is indeed the major challenge, and it is the prerequisite for becoming a nation and not just a state. So that's the one thing. The second thing I would think is utterly important is to understand that even powerful nations, post-imperial nations, post-imperial in the sense they once had an empire, no longer do. And I'm thinking less of Great Britain, they have their hang-ups, but I'm thinking about the major hang-ups of France, right? Post-imperial nations may think they can run the show, they can defend themselves, they can provide for their own wealth and welfare, they can provide their own laws. They don't. Very simply, whatever Macron does or whatever any previous prime minister did in France, whatever the right things in France, European nations, by the very fact of being European nations, have something that social scientists call, in a complicated way, nested sovereignty. De facto, we are part of a whole, the grin of the cat, as it were. And Moldova is no different in that. Add to this the third point. In this case, Moldova's future is effectively decided by the war over Ukraine. Whatever happens with Ukraine will decide and will shape, I should say, not decide, because there's many things that happen. But whatever happens with the outcome of that war, it will shape the options that even the best civic society of Moldova has. What will be the end result in any case is not a nation that stands on its own feet as if it were a self-enclosed monad or subject. It will always be, in one way or the other, part of a nested system of sovereignty. And the assumption that you could stand on your own, an assumption that you see in the Near East, simply does not work for the Near East. It certainly doesn't work for for Europe either. And that is not just for countries relatively new countries with an old tradition, right, like Moldova, but it works also for seemingly very powerful countries like Germany or Great Britain or France or Spain. You cannot stand on your own. You always stand in company. And how you organize that company is partly for you to decide, but partly for everyone else as well. Sovereignty is based first and foremost on the agreement of fellow sovereigns over recognizing you as a sovereign. The fact that that isn't the case in the Near East, that there is no such agreement, is, although there is a state system that fights war all the time, that's one of the differences between the two regions. But you have to recognize dependence and sovereignty, the simultaneity of it, which is, you know, in terms of scholarly parlance, kind of analyzed as nested sovereignty, and there is a huge literature on that. But practically it means that you're part of one world or the other, and the worst possible position that you can be in is indeed the borderland position that you're nowhere, that you are no one's land. Even if you have a civil society, then you're really then you're really in trouble, because in between there is just nothing that you can do, and that situation exists in parts of the world, but I hope Moldova is spared that situation.
Yeah, I agree very much, Michael, that Moldova's future depends on the war in Ukraine, the results of the war, of the Russian-Ukrainian war. And we are more specific even, we are saying if Odessa would be part of Ukraine, we are safe. If Odessa falls, we are lost. We are lost. We cannot even hope for a borderland. You know, we would be part of the Novorossiya. But hopefully, actually, going back to the older actors in the area, imperial ones, hopefully Turkey, as a heir of Ottoman Empire, would have a very positive impact on that, because I think, especially if we're talking about post-imperial nations in the area, especially Turkey is not interested in Black Sea becoming a 90% Russian sea, and hopefully European Union would get some that you said, you know, it lacks, it's formally it's an empire, but it lacks this kind of military infrastructure and capability to react. So what we can do is to hope and
well, there is another word, of course, apart from balkanization, that kind of is a ghost of in Europe. It's Finlandization, right? That is creating a neutral space that is effectively influenced by one side or the other. Now, I'm not predicting the future, and I certainly won't predict the future for Moldova. That's not my job. You have to work that out. But what I should say about Finland is that it's a reminder that a strong civil society, a sense of, and that's a created sense. It is not naturally there because you're born from Finnish mothers, but it is something that is created by civic community acts of togetherness, symbolic and very physical, real, providing for the majority of the people, giving them possibilities to express themselves, etc., etc. Creating that society, that was something the Finns were absolutely fabulously doing, and they had certain advantages. They had a language nobody wanted to speak, but quite apart from that, I mean, creating that civic spirit allows you to live in these neutralized spaces that seem to be at the edge of the world, but are not. And so this is just thinking strengthening civil society is the prerequisite for becoming real, becoming a sovereign. And as a sovereign, one would hope that that Moldova is part of Europe. And we hope that Europe will exist.
Yeah, it's very interesting with federalization. You know, Finland became a part of NATO because of in the context of the wars, you know, and Sweden as well. Another traditionally neutral, more like Switzerland, but Finland was imposed, you know. But what is interesting is that in this area, other actors, other states are imposed to become neutral, to become a new Finland, and it's about Ukraine. But interestingly enough, the president of Finland said to Ukraine, this is one of the most staunchest supporters of Ukraine going to the end, not accepting humiliation from the Russian Federation, you know, plan to seize the occupied territories. So if we don't have any other questions, I think we can stop here. It's 11:30. Thank you very much, Michael. Again, Laura, thank you very much for being here and making Moldova for 2 days a kind of not the end of the world. Thank you very much.